I fell asleep serving dinner to a mafia boss. I never expected to wake up in his bed beside him. The tray was still in my hands when the room began to tilt. I remember the sound of porcelain sliding, the soft ring of silver against silver, and the way Adrian Moretti's eyes met mine across the desk with something close to recognition. He knew, before I did, that neither of us was going to stay awake. My knees folded first. Then his shoulders slumped forward. The last thing I saw was a small red light blinking from the top of a bookshelf that had held no camera an hour earlier. When I opened my eyes again, I was not on the study floor. I was in a bed that smelled like cedar and gun oil. My apron was gone, and the most feared man on the East Coast was lying beside me, his shirt unbuttoned, his hand resting against the small of my back. If you are the kind of person who needs to know how a story ends before you can breathe easy, stay with me, because before sunrise I served that same coffee to the man who had tried to kill us both. And he drank it. My name is Quinn. I am 34 years old, and 6 months ago I could not have imagined saying any of this out loud. I had spent most of my adult life loading stretchers into the back of an ambulance, until a shoulder injury took that career away from me. For the 2 years after that, I balanced catering trays for people who never remembered my face between courses. That is what I was doing the night I was hired to serve a private dinner at the Moretti estate. The agency called it a closed guest list. The pay was $3,000 for one shift, cash, and the only rule was that I was not to look directly at the host unless he spoke to me first. I needed the money. My small catering company had 2 months of rent left in the account and a walk-in cooler that had started making a sound I could not afford to fix. I said yes before I let myself think too hard about who the host might be. The estate sat at the end of a private road that curved through a stand of black pines, and the first thing I noticed walking up the service drive was how quiet it was. No dogs, no radios, no sound from the road once the front gate closed behind me. 2 men in dark suits stood at the kitchen door. One checked my identification against a printed list, then checked my face against a photograph I had never given anyone. He did not smile. He did not say hello. He held the door open just wide enough for me to step through sideways and said, "You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not enter the West Wing. You do not carry a phone." Then he took my phone and locked it in a small metal box with 6 others, wrote my name on a strip of tape, and stuck it to the lid. I had told my brother before I drove up that if he did not hear from me by 2 in the morning, he should call the agency and ask if I had left the property. He laughed and told me I was being dramatic. I laughed back and told him he was probably right. Then I drove up the private road anyway, because $3,000 was $3,000, and a failing compressor meant a month of expenses I could not miss. Inside, the kitchen smelled like rosemary and butter, and something sharper underneath, the way a house smells when the people inside it are used to hiding things. The head chef, a woman named Rosa DeLuca, was 62 years old, with gray hair pinned up by a pencil. She studied me for a long moment before handing me my black service jacket. "Keep your eyes down and your hands steady," she said. "The men in this house measure a stranger by how long it takes her to notice she is being measured." I told her I understood. She said, "No, you do not. But you will." Then, without looking at me, she added, "If a man in this house asks your last name, give him a different one. It does not matter which, just not your own." I asked her why. She said, "A first name is a person. A last name is a family. And in this house, a family is a list of people who can be reached." Adrian Moretti walked into the kitchen at exactly 7 o'clock. He was 51, taller than I expected, and he moved through a room the way weather moves through a valley, slow and inevitable. Every server dropped their eyes. I dropped mine too, but only for a moment, and when I looked up again he was looking directly at me. I did not flinch. I said, "Good evening, sir," in the same steady voice I used for every client, and I saw something register in his expression, a small pause, as if a chair he expected to be empty had someone sitting in it. He nodded once and walked past me into the dining room. Behind him, a broad-shouldered guard named Polly glanced my way, the way a man looks at furniture he intends to move later. I noticed it and filed it away. Rosa noticed me noticing. If any part of you is already wondering whether a man like that could be worth listening to, do me one favor before I go on. Tap follow, because what happened over the next 4 hours will not make sense unless you hear all of it, and I promise the ending is not the one you are imagining. Now let me tell you about the dinner. 7 men sat at the table. Adrian at the head, 3 older captains to his right, 2 lawyers to his left, and at the far end, closest to the door, a younger man in a charcoal suit with Adrian's same dark eyes, but a softer, less finished face. That was Nico Moretti, 30 years old, Adrian's nephew, raised as his own son since Nico was 12. Nico smiled at the servers. He asked one her name and thanked her for pouring his wine. He asked another about her children and remembered a birthday. He was the only person at that table who behaved the way a person is supposed to behave. That should have been the first thing I noticed. It was not. Kindness in a house like that one, I would learn, is almost always a receipt someone plans to cash later. What I noticed first was that Adrian disliked being watched. He kept glancing at the mirrored panel behind the sideboard, and every time a server lingered near his shoulder, his jaw tightened by a fraction. So I refilled his glass from the far side and stepped back before he had to look at me. The second time I did it, he set down his fork for half a second and studied me again. I understood then that the line between being invisible and being seen was thinner than I had ever been taught. Between the second and third course, Adrian tapped his knife against his glass, and the room went silent as quickly as a closing door. By the end of this year, he said, every dollar this family earns will come from the shipping company. The old work is finished. The old ledgers will be burned in front of witnesses. Anyone who cannot accept that has until Sunday to say so. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. One of the older captains closed his eyes for a long moment. A lawyer pressed his thumb into the tablecloth. And at the far end of the table, Nico smiled a smile that never reached his eyes, lifted his glass, and said, "To the new family, Uncle." Adrian nodded. Nico drank. Somewhere in the careful stillness of his shoulders, I felt something wrong settle into the room like cold air under a door. The guests left before midnight, and Rosa sent most of the staff home by 12:30. But she pulled me aside in the pantry and said Mr. Moretti wanted one more coffee brought to his study, and that she wanted me to bring it because my hands were the steadiest in the kitchen. She pressed a small brass key into my palm and told me the study door would be locked from the inside, that I should knock twice and wait. Then, quietly, she said, "If you smell anything sweet in that hallway, do not go in. Come back to me first." I asked her what she meant. She did not answer. She only turned back to a copper pot that was already clean and began washing it again. As I walked away, she added, almost too low to hear, "There is a panel behind the fireplace in the study. If tonight goes wrong, press it." I asked how tonight could go wrong. She said, "It always can. That is what tonight means." I carried the tray down the long hallway toward the study. I smelled nothing sweet, only cedar polish, old paper, and the leather of the chair Adrian was sitting in when he opened the door. He had loosened his tie and looked tired in a way money cannot fix. He gestured to the desk and said, "Set it down, then sit." I told him I was not permitted to sit. He said, "Tonight you are?" So I sat on the edge of a leather chair across from him, hands folded in my lap, and watched him pour his own coffee for the first time all evening. He drank half of it in one swallow, the way tired men do, then looked at me over the rim of the cup and asked why I had not flinched when he walked into the kitchen. I told him the truth. I had spent 9 years as an emergency medical technician, and the only people who still frightened me were the ones who did not know they were dangerous. He set the cup down. He did not smile, but the corner of his mouth moved. "Then you and I understand each other," he said. That was the last full sentence I heard him speak before the room began to slide. I want to tell you I fought it, that I recognized the taste of a sedative in coffee I had not yet touched, that I lunged for the door and saved him. I did not. My hands went numb first, then my mouth, and I remember thinking clearly that this was not exhaustion, because exhaustion does not turn the edges of your vision blue. I remember Adrian pushing up from his chair, reaching under the desk for something, a weapon or a button, I never learned which, and I remember his knees buckling before his fingers could close on it. I remember the small red light on the bookshelf. I remember a door opening somewhere behind me that I could not see. Then nothing. When I woke, the first thing I understood was that I was warm, and warmth in a strange place is always the beginning of something worse. I was under a heavy blanket. My blouse was still buttoned, but my apron was gone, and my hair, pinned up at 6 o'clock, now hung loose around my shoulders, as if someone had removed the pins one at a time. Beside me, Adrian lay unconscious on his back, his shirt open to the third button, his left hand resting against my hip in a way that would look, in a photograph, like tenderness. Across the room, on a low dresser, a small camera sat on a tripod, its red light burning steady. Under the door, curling in like fog on a lake, I could see the faint shimmer of air where air should not have been shimmering. I sat up too fast, and the room tilted, and I understood 3 things in the order an emergency worker understands them. First, we had been sedated, not intoxicated, because my pupils were not tracking light the way alcohol makes them track. Second, the shimmer under the door was heat distortion from a gas leak, not fog. Third, we had less time than it takes to boil an egg before that gas would put us to sleep in a way we would not wake from. I shook Adrian. He did not stir. I struck him hard enough that my palms stung, and his eyes opened halfway before falling shut again. So I did what I had done 100 times in the back of an ambulance. I got behind him, hooked my arms under his, and dragged him off the bed onto the floor, since gas gathers at ceiling height, and the air near the baseboards would be cleaner. Then I crawled to the window, wrapped the corner of the blanket around my fist, and drove it through the glass. The alarm did not sound. That was the worst thing I understood that morning. Someone had disabled it from inside the house. Cold air rushed in, and Adrian coughed himself awake on the floor beside me. His eyes found mine before they found anything else in the room, and I watched him work through the same calculation I had already worked through, only faster than most men could have. He looked at the camera. He looked at his open shirt. He looked at me, and for one long, terrible second I saw him consider that I might have done this to him. His hand moved without his permission toward the nightstand drawer, and I said quietly, "If you open that drawer, I am going to assume you did this to me, and I am going to jump out that window and take my chances on the lawn." He stopped and stared at his own hand as though it belonged to someone else. Then he said, in a voice I would remember for the rest of my life, "The coffee. Neither of us drank enough for this. It was in the water pitcher too." I nodded. "Someone is trying to kill you, Mr. Moretti," I said, "and they wanted the world to think I did it in your bed." He did not argue. He rose to his knees, then to his feet, steadying himself against the nightstand, and walked to the camera. On the small screen on its back, in a folder marked with that night's date, were 17 photographs. In every one, I lay in his bed, hair loose, his hand somewhere on my body, both of us with our eyes closed. In 3 of them, my blouse was unbuttoned to the second button. It was not unbuttoned now. Someone had done that, taken the photograph, then buttoned it back up. The care in that small gesture was what finally made me sit down on the floor and shake. Adrian stared at the screen for a long time before he said, without turning around, "These have already been sent." A small icon showed the folder had been uploaded, at 2:14 that morning, to 7 separate addresses. "My counsel," he said, "every senior man in this family has already seen these photographs, and whoever sent them told them I am dead, and that you are the woman who killed me." I asked how he knew what the message said. "Because if I were doing this," he answered, "that is the message I would send." By his estimate, we had less than an hour before the council arrived at the estate to confirm his death and elevate the next boss. The gas was still seeping under the door. We could not leave that way, and the only thing keeping me from full panic was the memory of Rosa warning me hours earlier not to smell anything sweet in that hallway. Rosa had known, if not that this would happen tonight, then that it could. And Rosa, I remembered, carried more keys on her belt than any housekeeper should have needed. I told Adrian about Rosa. He closed his eyes for one long breath, and I watched the calculation move across his face before he said, "Rosa raised me. If Rosa wanted me dead, I would have been dead at 19. He crossed to the wall beside the fireplace, pressed his palm flat against a panel of dark wood, and slid it open. Behind it was a narrow servant's passage, unlit, smelling of dust and cold stone. "Follow me," he said. "Stay close. Do not touch the walls. There are wires in some of them." I followed. The passage ran along the spine of the house behind every important room, and Adrian moved through it like a man walking through his own memory. We came out in the pantry off the kitchen, and Rosa was already there, sitting on a stool with her hands folded in her lap, waiting. She looked up when the panel slid open, and she did not look surprised. She looked relieved. I heard the window break, she said. I have been counting the seconds since. Then she began to cry quietly, without moving her hands, and told us everything in the time it took a kettle to boil. Nico had changed the staffing sheet 3 days earlier, replacing a regular server with a temporary one from an agency he had never used before. That was me. He had specifically requested a woman under 40 who worked catering jobs alone, without a partner or roommate who would ask questions if she did not come home. He had ordered a new coffee service for that night, with the cup selected personally by him. He had told Rosa to send the staff home early, and told the night security team to take a 2-hour break at midnight because his uncle wanted privacy. Rosa had not questioned any of it, because Nico was the heir, and the heir's orders were Adrian's orders, until they were not. Adrian sat down on the pantry floor. That is what I remember most clearly, not what he said, because for almost a minute he said nothing at all. He simply sat on the cold tile with his back against the shelving, his face in his hands, breathing the way men breathe when they are trying not to make a sound. Rosa reached out and touched the top of his head once, the way one touches a child. I understood then that the story I was inside was not a story about a mafia boss and a maid. It was a story about a man learning, at 51, that the boy he had raised had wanted him dead since he was old enough to want anything at all. I gave him 30 seconds. Then I said, "Mr. Moretti, we do not have time for this. Your counsel will be at the front door in 40 minutes. He looked up. His eyes were red but dry. "Call me Adrian," he said. I told him a plan. It was not a good plan, but it was the only one that used the single advantage we had, which was that Nico did not know we were alive. I would go back through the passage, put my apron on, walk into the breakfast hall through the servant's door as though nothing had happened, and serve Nico the same coffee service he had used to poison us. I would set the same distinctive cup, the one with a small chip on the handle I had noticed at 7 o'clock, directly in front of him, and announce in front of every senior man in the family that the police were on their way to collect it, because someone had reported finding his fingerprint under the handle. "He wore gloves," Adrian said. "I know," I said. "That is the point. If he wore gloves, he will say so. And he will only know he wore gloves if he was the one who prepared the cup." Adrian was quiet for a long time. Then he asked where he would be while I did this. I told him. He did not like it, but he agreed, because we had run out of other options. Rosa unlocked a small closet behind the pantry and gave me a fresh apron. She fixed my hair with the same pins I had worn earlier and wiped a smudge of soot from my cheek with her thumb. Then, quietly, she said, "If he asks where the boss is, tell him you saw the boss die. Say it plainly. Do not decorate it. Men like Nico believe simple things." She handed me the tray. On it were 7 cups, 6 ordinary, and 1, in the center, with a hairline chip on the handle. I carried it up the back stairs. The breakfast hall was full. All 6 of Adrian's senior captains and both lawyers sat at the long table, and at its head, in Adrian's chair, sat Nico, already dressed in a black tie, already in mourning. When the door opened and I stepped in with the tray, every head turned, and the silence that followed was the kind that follows a gunshot. Nico stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. "You were supposed to be dead," he said. I did not answer right away. I set the tray on the sideboard and began pouring coffee the way I had been trained, from the right, 1 cup at a time. My hands did not shake, which surprised me. "I ran," I said without looking up. I heard him fall, and I ran. I did not know what to do. I let my voice break slightly on the last word, the way an emergency worker learns to let a voice break when a story needs selling. I set the chipped cup in front of Nico and said, "The police are already on their way. They found a print under the handle of the cup he drank from. They asked me to keep it here until they arrive." Nico looked at the cup, then at me, and then, incredibly, he laughed, a small breathless sound. "That is impossible," he said. "I wore gloves." The room did not react at first. It took 2 full seconds for the words to settle. I watched the oldest captain, a man named Vincent, close his eyes the exact way he had at dinner when Adrian announced the shipping company. I watched a lawyer's hand freeze halfway to his cup. I watched Nico realize, in real time, that he had just spoken his own confession aloud in front of every man whose loyalty he had spent a decade trying to inherit. He tried to correct himself. "I mean, if I had prepared a cup," he said, "I would have worn gloves. I always wear gloves in the kitchen." But it was too late. The room had already shifted. Then the door at the far end of the hall opened, and Adrian Moretti walked in. He did not run. He did not raise his voice. He walked to the head of the table, stopped behind his own chair, and rested one hand on its back. He looked at Nico for a long moment before he spoke. "You told me at dinner tonight, in front of these men, that you would drink to the new family," he said. "I watched you drink. I watched you smile at me. Then you went upstairs, turned a camera on a woman you had never met, and left her to die in my bed so this family would believe I died that way." He paused. "Say something, Nico. Say anything. But do not lie to me again." Nico's hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. Rosa, standing behind me with a folded coat over her arm, stepped forward and set the coat gently on the sideboard. From its inside pocket, she drew a small dark pistol and placed it beside the coat, out of reach. "I collected this when you came in," she said, without looking at him. "I was going to give it back." "Rosa," Nico said. "I raised you too." "Nico," she answered. "And I know the difference." Vincent, the old captain, rose slowly. He looked at Adrian, then at Nico, then at the chipped cup in front of Nico, untouched, and finally at me, a temporary server standing beside a sideboard in a house I had entered 10 hours earlier. "The boss is alive," he said to the room. "The heir has confessed. This matter is closed." He sat back down, and one by one, the other men did the same. Nico did not sit. He stood in the middle of the hall, hands open at his sides, and looked at Adrian. "I did it because you are killing us," he said. "You are turning us into farmers, into bookkeepers. My father did not die, so his brother could turn our name into a shipping label. Every man at this table used to be feared. Now they will be audited." Adrian listened all the way through without interrupting. When Nico finished, he said quietly, "Your father died because he trusted the wrong man. I have spent 30 years making sure no one in this family has to trust the wrong man again. You were supposed to run the shipping company. I named you last week. The papers are in my safe. You would have had everything I built. You did not need to take it. You needed to wait. 6 days. That is how long you needed to wait to inherit legally what you tried to take by putting a stranger in my bed." Nico's expression changed then, the smallest crack running through a pane of glass, and I understood that he had not known. He had believed Adrian intended to give the empire away or dissolve it entirely. He had killed for something that was already his. He sank into the chair at the far end of the table, the same one he had sat in at dinner, and rested his forehead against the wood. For the first time since I had entered that house, I saw him look his real age, which was younger than mine and lonelier than anyone at that table had been paying attention to. Adrian did not kill him. I want that understood, because it is the part of the night I think about most. He turned Nico over that same morning to an allied family 2 states away, on the condition that Nico would live out his life on a farm they owned, working the land, never again holding a phone, a weapon, or a name that could reach anyone in the city. The old way, Adrian told the council, would have put a bullet in him at this table. The new way sends him somewhere he can do no more harm. That is the difference between what we were and what we are going to become. If any man here cannot live with that difference, the door is behind you. No one moved. Then Adrian looked at me, in front of all of them, and said, "This woman saved my life tonight with a coffee cup and a lie. She is not a servant in this house. She is not a witness to be paid off. She is an employee of the legitimate hospitality company we are opening this spring, and she will run it if she wants to." He said it the way a man reads a will, without softness, without pressure, simply a fact placed on the table. I could not answer him then. I set the coffee pot back on the tray and walked out of the breakfast hall on legs that did not quite feel like mine, and I sat on the back step of the kitchen and watched the sun rise over the black pines. Rosa brought me a blanket and sat beside me without speaking. After a long while she said, "He meant it. You know, the offer. He does not say things like that twice." I told her I knew. "Then take a week," she said. "Answer him after. And do not answer out of pity. He would rather hear no than hear yes for the wrong reason. That is the one thing about him that has never changed." I took the week. I did not spend it thinking about him. I spent it thinking about the woman I had been at 22, pushing a stretcher up a set of concrete stairs at 3 in the morning, and the woman I had been at 32, carrying a tray of appetizers through a room full of men who never remembered my face. I asked myself whether the woman I had become, the one who had placed a chipped coffee cup in front of a killer and made him confess by daylight, was someone I could keep being if I stayed. I decided she was. I answered him. I said yes, in writing, with a contract my own lawyer drew up that made me an executive of the hospitality company rather than a member of his household. He signed it without changing a single line. 2 months later, the shipping company opened. 4 months later, the hospitality company followed. The old ledgers were burned in the fireplace of the main dining room, in front of 6 witnesses, exactly as Adrian had promised that first night. I was one of them. Rosa was another. Vincent, the old captain who had stood up first in the breakfast hall, was a third. He caught my eye across the fire and nodded once, the way a man nods at someone who has earned the right to stand where she is standing. Before I tell you the last part, do me one small kindness. If any of this story has meant something to you, if you have ever been the invisible person in a room full of powerful men, subscribe and stay for the ending, because it is not what you think it is, and it is the only part of that night that was mine alone to choose. 6 months after the coup, on a Thursday evening in October, Adrian and I stayed late in his study going over the fall bookings for the hospitality company. It was nearly midnight when we finished. He stood and walked me to the door. He did not touch me. He never had. I stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. Adrian, I said, the first time I woke up in your bed, I did not know how I got there. I know, he said quietly. Tonight, I would like to know, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then held out his hand. I took it, and I walked with him, on my own 2 feet, down the hallway I had once been dragged through unconscious, and stepped into the room I had broken a window to escape. The window had been replaced. The camera was gone. The bed was made. I sat on the edge of it. He sat beside me. The last time I was in this room, someone was trying to destroy us, I said. This time, no one put me here but me. He did not answer with a speech. He turned toward me and placed his hand against my cheek, the same hand that had rested against my hip that first terrible morning. This time, when it touched me, I was awake for it. I chose it. He kissed me once, carefully, the way a man kisses someone he has waited a long time for permission to kiss. I stayed, not because he asked, because he never did. I stayed because for the first time in my life I had walked into a powerful man's room as someone he could not command, could not photograph, could not use. I stayed because the woman who had been carried into that bed unconscious was not the same woman sitting on the edge of it now, and the distance between those 2 women was the entire point of what we had survived. In the morning, I made the coffee myself. I carried 2 cups into the study and set them on the desk, then sat across from him in the same chair I had occupied the night we were poisoned. He looked at the cups, then at me. You could have handed me one, he said. I know, I said, but I wanted you to choose. He chose. I took the other. We drank. Nothing happened. That was the point. If you have made it this far, tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me whether you think I was brave the second time I walked into that room, or whether you think I was reckless. I have my own answer, but I want yours, because this channel is built on the people who stay until the end. My name is Quinn. I fell asleep serving a mafia boss. I woke up in his bed beside him. And 6 months later, on a Thursday night in October, I walked into that room again, on my own, with both eyes open, and chose the man the world had told me to fear. By then, he had learned to fear me a little too. That is the part no one tells you about powerful men. The moment they choose you back, they become more frightened than you are. And the only way any of it works, in the end, is if neither of you looks away first. Neither of us did.